Well, thank you, Michael. Thank you, Michael. Can you hear me in the back row?
Yes.
Sort of? Okay. I don't have a microphone, so I'll just have to lift up my voice, as they say. I'm going to move pretty quickly because I want to leave plenty of time for questions. All right? And I'm sure there will be plenty of questions. So do you all have a handout to help guide you?
Yes.
Oh, okay. Theology and the Gaza War. And I'm going to lay out...
Let me say something real quick.
Yes.
We only have one handout left. If we can share families or couples with.
There's a few up here. Okay.
And there is one right here.
So first, I'm going to talk about theology, and I'm going to lay quite a bit of background here, all right? Because it's necessary before we get into the actual Gaza war to try to understand it as Christians. Are you ready?
Yes. Go for it.
No one has any doubt that the Old Testament is all about the nation of Israel and the Jewish people. Even the first 11 chapters of Genesis, which are about the creation and the nations, are there, according to most scholars, to tell us why God created Israel after the failure of the nations at Babel. But most Christian scholars and theologians and pastors have thought that God does a big switcheroo when he brings Jesus on the scene in the New Testament. They have said that God changed his focus from Israel to the world, from the tiny people of the Jews to all the peoples of the world, from the tiny land of Israel to all the lands of the earth. And that while God made eternal promises in the First Testament, also called the Old Testament, about the Jewish people as his chosen people, and eternal promises about the land of Canaan being given to the Jewish people, they say he changed his mind with Jesus. When a majority of Jews in the first century failed to accept Jesus as their Messiah, they say God changed his mind. He transferred all his promises about the Jews being his chosen people to the Gentiles, who soon came to be the majority of the Christian churches. And he was no longer interested in this tiny strip of land on the eastern shore of the Mediterranean, but now he had the whole world in his hands, as a famous singer once sang. He was from now on the God of all the lands of the world, so the land of Israel was no longer holy, no more so than the Philippines or Ukraine. I used to think that too, but then I had a wake-up call. I started to notice what was right on the surface of the text of the New Testament, but had never noticed. I never saw these things because I'd been taught they were not there. I had been told by other scholars that neither Paul nor Jesus believed the Jews were still the chosen people, and that neither Jesus nor Paul believed in the land promise anymore, and that Israel would play no special role in the future. I believed these scholars, who were in the majority. And so even while reading the New Testament, even while having read the New Testament in Greek for 30 years before my wake-up call, this is because I learned classical Greek in high school, in a Jesuit high school in New York City, I never saw these things until they jumped off the page one day. It started with reading Paul in Romans 11:28, where he was talking about his fellow Jews who did not believe in Jesus. He said they are, not were, they are still beloved because of their fathers, who were Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. So God had not lost his love for them. Were they still his chosen people? Well, he just said they were still beloved. And he repeats it in the next verse. The gifts and calling of God are irrevocable, not to be revoked, not taken away. The calling of God. Now what's that? God's calling, the genealogy of Abraham, not a race. Jews are not a race. Don't make that mistake. God's calling the genealogy of Abraham to be his chosen people. That, he says, cannot be revoked, cannot be taken away, even if most Jews by this time, about 57 AD, when he wrote Romans, had not yet accepted Jesus. And why hadn't they? Paul tells us, because God had closed their eyes. God had sent, this is verse 25 in Romans 11, a partial hardening, which means God had closed the eyes of part of Israel, which in Paul's day, toward the end of his life, meant a majority of his brothers. And why would God do that? Why would he close their eyes? I don't have time to prove this, but suffice it to say there are clear signs in Romans 9 through 11 that the reason God sent this partial hardening was to open up time and space for Gentiles to be grafted into the olive tree of Israel. So, God closed the eyes of a majority of Jews, Paul said, in order to offer salvation, which Jesus said to the Samaritan woman comes from the Jews. John 4. So Paul says that God closed the eyes of a majority of the Jews in order to offer salvation to the Gentiles. Now back to Romans 11:29. Paul said that not only the calling of Israel as his chosen people is still in place, but so were the gifts. Now, what are the gifts? He names them in Romans 9:4. The very first gift, he says in Romans 9:4, is the sonship. The sonship, where God told Moses to tell Pharaoh in Exodus 4, verse 22, that Israel is my firstborn what? Son. Friends, God says here that the Jewish people are the son of God in a way that no other people on earth are. This is another way of putting calling. Paul's word in 11:28. God's calling of Israel to be his firstborn son, his chosen people. Now let's go back to the gifts to Israel that Paul says are irrevocable, never to be revoked, cannot be taken back. When Jews in Paul's day, for instance, Philo, the great Jewish philosopher, contemporary of Paul, and Ezekiel the tragedian, and even Josephus, the great Jewish historian, all of these were contemporaries of Jesus and Paul. When they talked about God's gifts to his Jewish people, the principal gift they had in mind always was the land of Israel. This is probably at the top of the list of what Paul meant by gifts. Now Luke confirms this when he tells us in Acts chapter 13 that when Paul preached at a synagogue in Antioch of Pisidia, that's modern Turkey, he affirmed the land promise. Quote, Paul says, men of Israel, and that's the Jews in the synagogue, and you who fear God. Those are the God-fearers who are Gentiles, who came to the synagogue because they recognize the God of Israel is the true God. Listen, he said, the God of this people, Israel, chose our fathers, same term that Paul uses in Romans 11, chose our fathers, and it means the patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. The God of this people, Israel, chose our fathers and made the people great during their stay in Egypt, and with uplifted arm led them out of it. And after destroying 7 nations in the land of Canaan, is Paul embarrassed by the conquest? No, he's not embarrassed at all. He gave them, who's the them? The genealogy of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, the Jewish people. He gave them what? Their land as an inheritance. Acts 13, 16 through 19. Check it out. So let's sum up what we've seen so far. Paul says the Jews are still God's chosen people in a way that no other people are, even though most in his day had not yet seen that Jesus is the Jewish Messiah. Now, probably hundreds of thousands had. And I go into the evidence for that in my book on the history of redemption. But nevertheless, still it was not 51%. So still a majority did not see Jesus as their Messiah. Paul also believed in the land promise. that God gave the land of the 7 nations in Canaan to his chosen people. Even though the land at that time, during the life of Jesus and Paul, was that land was controlled by the Romans, by the Gentiles. Nevertheless, Paul said it had been given to the Jewish people, and in some sense was still theirs, even though Gentiles, the Romans, were in control of it, militarily and politically. Now, what about Jesus? Did he believe the Jews were the chosen people still, even though he had come to be their Messiah and also Messiah to the world? There's plenty of evidence that he did. In Matthew 5, toward the beginning of the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus expresses supreme reverence for Torah. Now that's the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of our Bible, and the prophets. He said, do not think, so some people were thinking this, do not think that I have come to abolish Torah or the prophets. I have not come to abolish them, but to fulfill them. Now that's a Greek word that translates a Hebrew term for give a deeper interpretation of. I have come to fulfill them. For truly I say to you, until heaven and earth pass away, not an iota, that's the Greek word, smallest letter in the Greek alphabet, nor a horn, chorion in Greek, the smallest stroke of the pen in Hebrew. Not an iota nor a horn will pass away from Torah until all of it is accomplished. Strangely, Christians for the last 1,700 years have thought that Jesus came to do away with Judaism and start a new religion called Christianity, despite what Jesus says here. For if Jesus wanted to do away with first-century Judaism, he would never have expressed such reverence for Torah, where God tells the world that he has chosen the Jewish people forever to be his firstborn son, a nation of priests, to show the world who the true God is. That's what a priest is, first and foremost. A priest is someone who points the world around him to the true God and says, that's the true God, not that God, not that God. No, that's the true God. It's the God of Israel, whose son is the Messiah by the Holy Spirit. That's the true God. That's what a priest does. And a nation of priests tells all the world that's the true God, the God of Israel. Exodus 19, you shall be to me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. As Peter the Jew puts it, speaking to Jewish Jesus followers, 1 Peter is addressed to a Messianic Jewish congregation, not a Gentile congregation of folks. There were a few there, but it was mostly Jewish. Peter says in 1 Peter, the purpose of a holy nation is what? To proclaim the excellencies of him, the God of Israel, who called you out of darkness into his marvelous light. And it's in Torah that God also says over and over that he has given them the land of the nations, the 7 nations of the Canaanites, who had forfeited the land because of their perversities, their child sacrifice, their temple prostitution, their incest, their adultery, their homosexuality, their bestiality, and worship of nature and its gods. Sounds like our culture. Most Christians, especially Protestants, have no idea that the rabbis distinguished between light and heavy commandments, and that Jesus used this distinction in the very next verse of Matthew 5. Jesus says, whoever relaxes one of the least of these commandments, so notice, there are least commandments and there are great commandments. Whoever relaxes one of the least of these commandments and teaches others to do the same will be called least in the kingdom of heaven, but whoever does them and teaches them will be called great in the kingdom of heaven. Notice in the kingdom of heaven, there are least folks, but they're still in the kingdom, and there are great folks, but they're still in the kingdom. There are levels in the kingdom of heaven. What would be one of the least commandments that Jesus has in mind here? Perhaps some of the commandments about sacrifices and purity in Leviticus, which are applicable to Jews and not to Gentiles, even righteous Gentiles. Most Christians would say that of all the books in the Old Testament, Leviticus is the most expendable. Why do we read Leviticus? Most Christians would say. And that the rules for sacrifices and purity in Leviticus have no relevance for Gentile Christians. But notice that Jesus does not permit that attitude to his followers. Now Matthew knows by the time of his writing, probably after 70 AD, that there are Gentile followers of Jesus, plenty of them. And Matthew was no doubt a Jew himself, who was aware that many commandments in Leviticus are intended for Jews, but not for Gentiles. Yet, as he tells the story of Jesus, and as he quotes Jesus, Jesus does not discuss those kinds of distinctions. Jesus is focused, apparently, in this Sermon on the Mount, chapter 5, on his Jewish disciples. Even the light commandments, the least commandments, are not to be relaxed or discarded. The point is that from all we know of Jesus in the New Testament, he did not reject Jewish law, Torah. Quite the contrary. And because the Torah makes clear that God's covenant with the Jewish people is eternal, and that God gave the land to the Jewish people, it is certain that Jesus held to both of these propositions. There is nothing in the New Testament that suggests otherwise. Now I'll give one example that's often used to suggest otherwise. Just before these profound statements about Torah, Jesus gives his Beatitudes. And among them is the following famous one: blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the what? Best translation is land. Now many will protest at this point, pointing to nearly all English translations that Jesus used the word for earth. For they will inherit the earth, showing that Jesus had given up the land promise. He was pointing his followers to the whole earth, suggesting that the land promise was too narrow and parochial, now that the Messiah had come for the whole world. But the Greek word here is gay, which, like the Hebrew word which it translates, eretz, can mean either land or earth. More and more scholars have come to realize that Jesus is quoting word for word Psalm 37:11. The meek shall inherit the land. And how do we know there it's land and not earth? Because that phrase, inherit the land, occurs 5 times in Psalm 37. And in every instance, eretz clearly refers to the land of Israel and not the world. Now, did Jesus talk about a future for the people or the land of Israel? Many scholars and pastors have said no, and that's what I was taught in graduate school, plus my undergraduate days at the University of Chicago. But recent research, unblinded by replacement theology, also called supersessionism, as in supersede, shows otherwise. I will mention 3 instances in which Jesus talked about a future for the Jewish people and a future for the land of Israel. First, in Luke 21, when Jesus was talking about the coming destruction of Jerusalem, and also the end of the world, the first as a symbol of the second. He prophesied that one day Jerusalem would cease to be trampled upon by the Gentiles. Remember that verse? Luke 21:24. That what does trample upon mean? That's a technical term for to control politically and militarily. So Jesus talks about the time in the future when Jerusalem will cease to be controlled militarily and politically by the Gentiles. First he describes the fall of Jerusalem, and then he says there will be wrath against the Jewish people after this fall of Jerusalem. They will fall by the edge of the sword and be led captive among all nations. Now this is Luke 21. And Jerusalem will be trampled upon by the Gentiles until the times of the Gentiles come to an end. Jesus speaks with grief about these future tragedies, not Schadenfreude. Where's Bob, our German scholar? Not Schadenfreude, as N.T. Wright suggests. A Schadenfreude is pleasure over someone's misfortune. He does not speak with pleasure, as N.T. Wright has suggested. N.T. Wright is not a good guide to Israel. He's good in many ways, but he's terrible on Israel. He's great on Israel up until 30 AD. He's terrible on Israel after 30 AD. Now, when did Jerusalem stop being trampled upon by Gentiles, which means stop being controlled by Gentiles, militarily and politically?
1967.
As Michael just said. This happened during the Six-Day War of 1967 when Israeli paratroopers, one of whom is a friend of mine, Avihu Zakai, the brilliant Israeli Jonathan Edwards scholar. And who kept telling me for years, if I die, he wants to marry Jean.
I guess that's a
So,
compliment.
when Avi, my friend, and his fellow Israeli paratroopers captured East Jerusalem in 1967, this was the first time that Jews controlled politically and militarily all of Jerusalem in 2,000 years, the first time since Jesus made that prophecy. Now that was number one. Number two, the second time, when Jesus talked about the future of the Jewish people and the future of the land of Israel, was when he prophesied in Acts 1:6 that one day the kingdom would be restored to Israel. And as Jewish New Testament scholar, he's not a Christian, a Jewish New Testament scholar, good friend of mine, Isaac Oliver, as he wrote a few years ago in his incredible book, Luke's Jewish Eschatology, published by Oxford University Press. The context of Acts 1:6 makes clear that Jesus meant a social and political reality, which means that Jesus predicted that one day the nation of Israel will be restored as a kingdom. Third, Jesus predicted that one day the inhabitants of Jerusalem will welcome him. Will welcome him. Luke 13:35. Now that's not happened yet, nor has Israel as a kingdom been restored, but Jesus prophesied that both will happen. My point is that contrary to scholars and preachers who have said that Jesus did not see a future for Jerusalem or a future did not see a future for the Jewish people or a future for Israel, and was focused only on the whole world, the actual Jesus of the New Testament did indeed prophesy a future for both the Jewish people and for Israel, the land of Israel. Now, I don't have time to talk about the many other places in the New Testament where its authors, all of whom are Jews, by the way, even Luke, most likely a Jew, whose first language was Greek. All the places in the New Testament where its authors clearly affirm their conviction that the Jews are still God's chosen people and the land promise is still in effect. And by the way, the land promise is stated or repeated, guess how many times in the Old Testament? 1,000 times. I've counted them. 1,000 times in the Old Testament. So the next time you hear a sermon or read an article, now you won't hear that sermon here in this church, but the next time you hear a sermon somewhere else, or read an article or book, or hear someone preach or teach that God changed his mind on the eternal chosenness of the Jewish people, or that God changed his mind on the gift of the land of the chosen people, please remember these claims are not taught by the New Testament. They are not held by Jesus or Paul or Peter or any of the other authors of the apostolic documents. Jesus, Peter, Paul, John, they were all students of the Hebrew Bible, what we call the Old Testament, and believers in its every word. They held steadfastly to its teaching that God made an eternal covenant with the Jewish people and gave them the land of the wicked Canaanites who had forfeited the land by their abominable sins. All this is necessary to know, and now I make the transition. All that's background. All this is necessary to know in order to think Christianly about the war in Gaza and the looming war with Hezbollah and Iran. For if Jesus was concerned about the future of the Jewish people, and he was, and if Jesus believed the land of Israel was a gift to the Jewish people, and he did, then war in the land against a terrorist army that wants to kill all Jews and drive them off the land into the sea is theologically significant. Many have forgotten. So we need to remind ourselves about October 7th and what happened on October 7th, because many of us have forgotten. We need to remind ourselves of the photos and the videos of beheaded babies, the kidnapped Jewish teenage girl being pulled by her hair with blood between her legs, the little kidnapped boy being tormented by Gaza children, which you used to be able to see for a few days after October 7th, and very shortly it was removed from the internet. The 85-year-old grandmother taken to the Gaza Strip without her medicines to die alone and in great pain. We need to remember the children shot in front of their parents, the elderly disabled woman set on fire in her own house. We need to remember the women being raped beside the corpses of their friends, children and babies snatched from their parents. If we never heard, then we need to hear, and it's difficult, and forgive me, block your ears if you don't want to hear some horrible stuff. One survivor of the massacre at the music festival who said, "The guy who was with me didn't stop crying and begging for his life, and then he didn't scream anymore. They murdered him in front of my eyes." The organizer of the rave, where 260 of the revelers were slaughtered, said he saw young men and women, children and elderly, shot and hacked to death. By now there have been more than 1,400 Israelis killed then, 4,000 injured, 199 confirmed hostages, many of whom we now know are dead. This is being called Israel's 9/11, and it's Dunkirk. Remember Dunkirk? The beginning, just as Dunkirk was the beginning of Britain and the West's war for survival, this is the beginning of Israel's war for survival whose outcome is uncertain. Folks, there is nothing in the Bible, as I told audiences in Washington, D.C. last weekend, there's nothing in the Bible that promises there won't be another Holocaust. Yet some Christians refuse to condemn Hamas for these barbaric atrocities. The Episcopal Church in the United States mentions a time of violence, but fails to say Hamas was its instigator, suggests that occupation is the underlying cause, and charges that Israel's response is disproportionate. The United Methodist Church refers merely to an escalation of violence and urges both sides not to resort to further violence. No further violence? Would Americans have agreed to that after Pearl Harbor? As Elliot Kaufman at the Wall Street Journal has argued, this is really a call for Israel to surrender, knowing that her enemies will come back the next day to resume their massacres. Is occupation the cause of Hamas's savagery? It cannot be, for Israel stopped occupying Gaza in 2005, almost 20 years ago. And Palestinians have run that city-state by themselves ever since. But more importantly, occupation suggests to many that Hamas wants to share the land with the Jews. Yet Hamas declares openly it wants to drive every last Jew into the sea and kill everyone who tries to remain. The senior Hamas official, Musa Abu Marzouk, said in 2021 that his organization wants Israel, quote, to come to an end just like it began, close quote. The war that Hamas has launched on Israel, and now Hezbollah and Iran and the Houthis, is not about occupation, but elimination. Now, is Israel's planned response to destroy Hamas disproportionate? Article 51 of the UN Charter states that any nation is justified in defending itself against armed attack. The response needs to satisfy the principle of proportionality, which involves avoiding as much as possible the killing of non-combatants. More than any other world power in military history, the IDF, the Israeli Defense Force, has gone out of its way to avoid killing civilians. Gentile military experts like the British General John Spencer have shown this over and over again. But that's impossible when Hamas uses human shields by putting its command centers in hospitals and schools and mosques and orders its civilians not to move to escape Israeli bombs. Therefore, comparing the number of Palestinians killed to Jews killed misses the point. Hamas deliberately targets civilians, while Israeli forces have always tried to minimize civilian casualties. And more importantly, Hamas is responsible for all of its civilian deaths because it cruelly forces Gaza residents to remain with the terrorists who will be targeted by the IDF, and rightly so. As Arab Muslim Bassam Tawil writes, quote, Hamas had an opportunity to turn the Gaza Strip into the Singapore of the Middle East in 2006 and 7 when it took over. But its desire to destroy Israel has brought only war and death to the Palestinians. To achieve its goal of murdering Jews and eliminating Israel, Hamas appears ready to sacrifice endless numbers of Palestinians. And Sinwar, the leader of Hamas, was quoted by the Wall Street Journal last week saying, the more Palestinians who die, the better. How should we respond as Christians? First, we are called by both testaments to hate evil. Proverbs says the fear of the Lord is the hatred of evil, as Proverbs 8. And the Apostle Paul urges us to abhor what is evil. And the word abhor means hate in Romans 12. If we hate Nazism and its evils, we should hate the evil of Hamas, the new Nazism, and not be afraid to say so publicly. For in fact, Hamas comes from the movement that worked closely with Nazi leader Heinrich Himmler, who helped train its imams to kill Jews. This is not Islamophobia. There are millions of Muslims who also hate Hamas. It was interesting. Last weekend in D.C., because I took the train up, I didn't have a car, and so I had to use Uber about 8 times, and I was always curious. And all my Uber drivers were from other countries, and some of them were Muslims. And I probed and probed and probed, and once they trusted me that I wasn't a typical DC resident, once I earned their trust, they said, we hate Hamas because they're making all of us Muslims look bad. And we hope Israel destroys Hamas. But don't tell them.
Yeah, right.
But don't tell anybody I said it. Jesus hated evil. He praised the church. One of the 7 churches in Revelation 2 for hating the works of the Nicolaitans, which I also hate. Jesus said that. I also hate their works. These were works of idolatry and sexual immorality. Jesus also suggested he was not a pacifist, but believed, as Ecclesiastes put it, there's a time for war. In the parable of the wicked tenants in Matthew 21, Jesus inspired Matthew to write that wicked, or the good vineyard owner, punished the wicked tenants who killed his servants and then his son by, quote, putting those wretches to a miserable death, close quote. This is the same Jesus whose robe is dipped in blood and from whose mouth comes a sword that slays the wicked in Revelation 19. This is the same Jesus who, according to Jude, in a verse that happily the ESV rightly translates, in verse 5 of Jude, destroyed those who did not believe. Jesus destroyed those who did not believe. Now he's referring to the 23,000 in the wilderness who were killed in one day, according to Paul in 1 Corinthians 10 and the text of Exodus, for their idolatry and sexual immorality. Jesus is the one who killed them, Jude says. All the fathers believed, all the fathers before Augustine believed that it was the second person of the Trinity, not the Father, who had all direct communication. I talked about this last time I was here, with sinners after the fall. And so it was Jesus who did the destroying in the wilderness, not the Father. The point is that while Jesus calls us to love our enemies, this love does not contradict the tragic need for nations to defend themselves against those who seek their elimination. That's a bit of biblical grounding, and there's much more, for a second Christian response. So the first Christian response that the Bible teaches us is to hate what is evil, to hate the evil of the new Nazism called Hamas and Hezbollah and Iran and the Houthis. The second Christian response is the just war tradition, which really is the Christian, it's largely Christian because its principal progenitors were St. Augustine and Thomas Aquinas. Fundamental to that just war tradition, as it has developed since the time of Aquinas, and especially in the last 80 years since the Holocaust, is the idea that the genocidal, and genocidal side means hate, from Kaido, and gens is a people, to hate and kill a whole people, and all people who are all individuals who are members of a particular people. It's usually translated race, but gens, strictly speaking, does not mean race, and not in the modern sense of race that is determined by skin color. So in the just war tradition, fundamental to the just war tradition is the idea that the genocidal attempt to exterminate a people, a nation, or an ethnic minority is a great moral evil. Yet this is precisely what Hamas intends, and Hezbollah, and Iran, and the Houthis. Article 7 of Hamas's founding charter quotes a saying of the Prophet Muhammad. The day of judgment will not come about until Muslims fight the Jews, when the Jew will hide behind stones and trees. The stones and trees will say, "O Muslims, O Abdullah, there's a Jew behind me, come and kill him." Now, the Islamists put this on the internet, put this all over the internet in the days after October 7th and said, we are doing what Muhammad told us to do. A second principle of war, of just war, is that of discrimination, that non-combatants should never be directly and intentionally targeted. Yet this is precisely what Hamas did in its horrific attacks on babies, children, unarmed women, and the elderly. A third principle is proportionality. Secondary effects such as unintentional killing of civilians must be proportional to the military advantage of an attack. In this case, Israel's purpose is to defend herself against an enemy bent on her elimination, which makes her war against Hamas and Hezbollah justified. When Hamas uses Gazan citizens as human shields, it is Hamas that is disproportionate in its brutal endangerment and sacrifice of its own citizens. Finally, the Hamas war on Israel and Hezbollah's and Iran's and the Houthis is also a war on Christians. Most Christians don't realize that. Its aim is the elimination of Christianity from this planet. In December 2022, a co-founder of Hamas, Mahmoud al-Zahar, announced, quote, and this was a video that I saw, "We are not talking about liberating our land alone. The entire 510 million square kilometers of planet Earth will come under a system where there's no injustice, no oppression, no Zionism, no treacherous Christianity." Jewish tradition has a saying, "Whoever is kind to the cruel will be cruel to the kind." If we Christians thought it was wrong to be kind to Nazis and Nazism, we must support those who are now on the front lines fighting the new Nazism. If we don't, we might be forced to take their place. Thank you. So, we have time for questions. Chris?
Where did this crazy hatred, where did it start? Why is there so much hatred for Jewish people? Why lead them the ones?
So Chris's question is, where did this hatred for Jewish people come from? It came from Satan. You know, the oldest hatred is the hatred for the Jewish people. And empire after empire after empire has tried to destroy the Jewish people, and none has been successful. And I think, I mean, it's pretty clear from Scripture that Satan knows the Jews are the chosen people. So he has a particular hatred for them. And he's the one who inspires empire after empire after empire. Where are the Babylonians who tried to destroy the Jewish people? Are they still around? Where are the Assyrians who tried to destroy the Jewish people? Are they still around? Where are the Hittites who had their own wars on the Jewish people? Are they still around? Where is the Greek Empire that tried to destroy the Jewish people under Antiochus Epiphanes? Is the Greek Empire still around? The Jews are the only people whose language has survived, whose religion has survived through history, because God has protected them. Now that doesn't mean, as I said a few minutes ago, that there won't be another Holocaust. I mean, there could be. And when you look at what the Israelis are up against on something like 8 fronts, it's very frightening. A military expert who, in fact, if we go back to Israel, and some of you are signed up, his name is Elliot Chodoff. He's led men into battle many times, and he was called up by the IDF even though he was 68 after October 7th to come down and advise them in Gaza. And I'm in touch with him. He told me, he said, you know, it's not true there are 150,000 Hezbollah missiles on the northern border aimed at Tel Aviv and aimed at Haifa and aimed all over Israel, and certainly Jerusalem. There are probably more like 250,000. And the Iranians are this far away from going nuclear. So, you know, and one bomb could destroy Israel and kill the 2 million Arab citizens of Israel. You know, they don't care about killing the Persians who are in Iran are not Arabs, by the way, and all the Arabs hate the Persians, as they always have. And they are secretly, all these Arab nations like Saudi Arabia are secretly hoping that Israel crushes Hamas and Hezbollah, etc., and particularly the head of the snake, as they put it, the Iranians. But they can't say that in public. But they're all hoping against hope that the Israelis absolutely crush all these guys. Leslie.
What should our response be? I mean, should we be praying for miraculous conversion? Should we be praying for destruction? Let's say like the Temple Mount. It's completely occupied by Muslims.
Right.
And
You know, this is a spiritual battle. Plus, it's an earthly military political battle. Pray against the principalities and powers who are driving these nations. Think of Daniel 10, where Daniel talks about the Prince of Persia. Pray accordingly. Pray for the worldwide propaganda battle that has turned against the Zionists, who simply, you know what Zionism is? It is simply the idea that, like every other people, the Jews deserve a nation state to protect them. And what did the 20th century show us, except that the Jewish people, of all people, need a nation state to protect them from their enemies? So pray for the propaganda battle, pray for the spiritual warfare, pray the Israelis are able to destroy their enemies. Michael.
Yeah, in the Old Testament, God tells Israel that if there's a disaster that comes upon them, to reflect and think about whether they've been faithful to the Lord, and then to, if not, then to repent and turn to Him. Has there been any such movement, since October 7th?
There are lots of things going on under the radar. I think the last time I might have told you this story, that the Messianic Jewish father of a soldier told me that his son reported that before October 7th, 1 in 10 of his fellow soldiers prayed. Now he says it's 9 out of 10 of his fellow soldiers pray every day. There's all kinds of things going on under the radar, which I have seen. My last trip in January and February was my 23rd trip. And I hear and see all kinds of things going on in Israel, including among the so-called secular Jews. You know, secular over there means something completely different from secular here. Secular over there means you don't like what the Israeli rabbinate says about weddings that and certain other things that the chief rabbis teach. But on Friday night, all over Israel, the vast majority of Israelis, and even the ones we call secular, are having a different kind of meal on Friday night. And on Yom Kippur, 95% of Israelis fast. So this is still a God-infested nation, a nation full of God awareness, despite what the secular media tells you. Kurt?
Is there any, in your visiting since October 7th, is there any resentment that the IDF let this happen, or that it, you know, the attack, that they weren't defended properly?
Kurt's question was, is there resentment in Israel now over the IDF permitting what happened on October 7th to happen? Yes, there's tremendous resentment and all kinds of cries for a national commission that will get to the bottom of it. And the Israelis always do this after every war, and they will do it. They'll probably throw out a Netanyahu at the next election. And you know, and even my conservative Israeli friends politically are in favor of getting rid of Netanyahu, despite the fact in many ways he is, as he's been called, the Winston Churchill of Israel. So he's very good. Apparently he had some lapses in judgment, because there were signs before October 7th that something was going to happen, and it was reported to the top military, and they all dismissed it because they had accepted the false belief, and even Elliot, everything was okay, that Gaza was contained because of the technological superiority they had at the border. And even my friend Elliot Chodoff, when I was there last May, before October 7th, and you know, he was my guide on a trip, Elliot said to our group of seminary professors whom we were leading around Israel, he said, the IDF is putting far too much confidence in technology. Nothing replaces eyes on the ground and boots on the ground, and they're going to come to regret it. And that's what everyone realizes now. There was far too much confidence in technology. You know, maybe the American military can hear this and ought to hear this, and not enough old-fashioned reliance on boots on the ground and eyes on the ground, which would have prevented what happened on October 7th. Tom?
I've always heard, I'm not sure where it is in the Bible, that all Israel shall be saved.
Yeah.
Does that mean if you're a Jew, regardless of how you believe, or regardless of whether you accepted Christ or anything, that you would be saved?
Right.
Just because of your Jewish roots?
Right. Tom asked, what does Paul mean when he says all Israel will be saved in Romans 11? Does it mean that just because you are born a Jew and have been bar mitzvahed or bat mitzvahed, that you'll automatically saved? No. That statement, all Israel will be saved, is a statement you find throughout the Mishnah, and in fact Torah and Talmud. And the rabbis have always made the distinction between, as Paul puts it in Romans 9, those who are in Israel and those who are of Israel. That's a rabbinic distinction, and they've always made that distinction, that those who are clearly repudiating the covenant will not be saved. So Paul is saying nothing new there. All Israel, which, look, it means, if not a majority, a representative huge portion of Israel will be saved. In Joshua it says all of Israel stoned Achan. Well, that's physically impossible for them all to have stoned Achan. It means, probably representatives of all 12 tribes. So no, Paul makes it very clear in Romans 10:9 that if you confess with your lips, this is Romans 10, right in the middle of his 3 chapters, his most mature statement on the relationship between Jews and Gentiles. Right smack in the middle, in chapter 10, verse 9, he says, if you confess with your lips and believe in your heart that Jesus is Lord and God raised him from the dead, you will be saved. So that's true of every Jew and every Gentile. Now, the next question is, well, what about my Jewish friend whom I knew very well, and he never confessed Jesus, and he loved the God of Israel, and he was faithful to the God of Israel? Well, does that mean he's going to hell? Paul doesn't say that. Paul says talks about the mystery of Israel. Now, personally, I think, and I talk about this in my little book called Israel Matters, toward the end. God is just, and God is holy. And C.S. Lewis is very good on this. That not after death, but sometime perhaps at the point of death, all those faithful Jews will see that the God of Israel really did have a son named Jesus, and that he really is the Messiah. And all those faithful Jews, not all Jews, but all the faithful Jews who love the God of Israel and laid their lives down for the God of Israel will see that they really, like Emoth in the last battle, was really worshiping the true God, although they didn't know it, and Emoth finally said, yes, of course.
Thank you.
Yes, sir.
Can a good
Sam.
faith that Moses would find other different people that knows Moses, the guy named Pharaoh, is actually been feeling to kill. He's actually doing some bad.
Oh, Dickon, can you?
I'm not sure.
I think you said this about people that
Can
obeyed Moses.
can people lead with Moses? Is only Pharaoh doing something weird with sin in the world?
So I think he's saying that so you're talking about people who followed Moses.
Yeah.
And can they know that Pharaoh is really Satan? Is that what you said?
Yeah.
Yeah, most people who follow Moses, in other words, Jews, know that Pharaoh really was Satan. Especially the Orthodox and the ultra-Orthodox. Now, the conservative and reform, who are not conservative theologically, would not say that. But the Orthodox and the ultra-Orthodox Jews today would say that. Sir?
In addition to the most important thing, which we mentioned before, which is prayer,
Yeah.
endless prayer.
Yeah.
What else should Christians be doing since it's a war on
Yeah. I would say the other important thing you can be doing is in public with your neighbors, defending Zionism.
Presently, I worked my 40-year career for companies that made ammunition for the Department of Defense. Small caliber, medium caliber, small rockets, medium rockets,
Yep.
large rockets.
Yeah.
These companies made it all. During that time, through foreign military sales to Israel and the actual grants that Congress gives of free ammunition to Israel, we were supplying 60 to 70% of Israel's ammunition as a country. When I retired, and that was 6 years ago, that was less than 50%. At the present point in time, the administrative state is not releasing the ammunition that, by law,
They're supposed to.
they're supposed to.
Yep.
So should Christians in this nation be working on some of that on behalf of Israel?
Yeah, to speak up politically. Now I just heard through my channels that one reason Netanyahu is waiting on the North to strike back at Hezbollah is because the Israeli defense industry is working double overtime to build up their munitions because they realize they cannot depend on the United States. And they realize that once they go to war with Hezbollah, the United States will try to stop them, will try to call a ceasefire, and they might run out of ammunition because the Americans are no longer reliable. So that's one reason he's putting it off, but hopefully it doesn't get put off too long because the head of the snake is very close to going nuclear.
Dave,
They were talking about ceasefire.
Well, last question, Dave?
This is more of a political question. Lebanon, the last time they went to war with Israel, they got demolished.
Yeah.
Why do they permit Hezbollah to have the power that they have?
What, Dave's question was, Lebanon, the last time they went to war, got demolished. Why do they permit Hezbollah to have the power that they have? Two answers, very short. The UN has permitted it, despite agreeing to police Hezbollah and not permit missiles, and they permit the missiles, that they look the other way. And number two is called guns and violence. If you're a Lebanese and you protest against Hezbollah, your family will be hauled off to be tortured and killed, and so will you.
Kind of like the people
Hey,
in Gaza.
pardon?
Kind of like the civilians in Gaza.
Exactly like in Gaza. But the tragic thing is, they've done polls of the Gaza civilians, and the vast majority, it's lessening some, but the vast majority hate Jews and support the war policies of Hamas. Thank you very much. And Bishop Mel, can you talk to, or can you first of all close us in prayer, and secondly, can you talk to me immediately after?
Also with you.
Heavenly Father, thank you for this time we've had together today. I thank you for the words you've given us through Jerry, both upstairs in the service and now here. I pray, Lord, that you would just further just cause us to ruminate over these thoughts and these words that you've shared with us. And then, Lord, lead us to action, yes, in prayer, but otherwise, as you might lead us. Help us, Lord, to be your salt and light here in the place where you have put us. Take us now from this place